Michelle.
Daniel.
OG Rose.
Tonight we're in the kitchen. It's a different sound. So we're going to try to get these dishes together, but as opposed to not recording something, we thought we would try a new sound experience. Maybe we'll be like we're in a diner or something. They'll think we're in a diner.
Oh, that would be nice.
That'd be pretty nice. So tonight we are going to discuss, we did that one, why right? So it's like, why philosophy? Which gets tied into question of like, how does it help with, say, mental illness, mental health? What's the point of philosophy? What does it do for us? Why do we do it? What's going on? You have people like Richard Rotary, who was basically saying, the dream of philosophy is dead, the whole reason it exists. All philosophy is it means that, some people read certain books, other people read other books, sociologists read X set of books, philosophers read Y set of books, and it's nothing more than that. And then you have other people who are like, no, philosophy is inevitable, it's an important part of life, every PhD is a philosophy. That's pouring granola, every PhD
this spiraled. Folks, this spiraled really quickly. We were cleaning the kitchen, which became Michelle's eating a snack.
You can eat as many snacks as you want. But no, it's very interesting. Like, what is philosophy? Yeah. You have a long tradition of philosophy being pharmaceutical medicine. And there's something also where Hegel, at the beginning in the first section, Elements of the Philosophy of Right, really talks about the tension of being, dare I say, thrown into the world, to use Heidegger's language, and having a sense that we should be able to will. Oh, you got yogurt. Wow, vanilla. This feeling that we should be able to do what we want to do, and yet we run into determinations and necessities, where it's kind of describing how, we have this feeling of an abstract freedom, which we're totally unbound, and then we come into the world and we're encountering necessity. And like for him, so much of philosophy is coming to terms with that kind of disconnect, that feeling of feeling like you ought to be able to do basically anything, and yet you can't. Mm-hmm. And then I think, basically, he wants to argue that the formation of the state, which is the state of nature, not just the governmental state, is helping us come to terms with that. Which, if you think of it that way, there's almost like an existential and even mental illness, mental stability situation that human society is in the business of, and that philosophy plays a necessary role in coming to terms with that. Dr. Lass will talk about the revenge of philosophy happening today, where given social construct, everything's falling apart, God is dead, the death of a paradigm, as Barth will put it, where nothing is stable, everything is melted in air, to go with Marx, and so philosophy is very important. But there is this interesting question of what is philosophy for, because you have this simultaneous, dare I say, neurotic sort of sense that philosophy doesn't matter, but then, philosophy doesn't matter, but then at the same time, it matters more than anything.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I think, too, there can be a way in which it does. I think there is a real way in which, even in trying to connect these two things, where, I mean, for us, where we talk about these subjects, we see how they're related. But in mainstream, the idea that philosophy could somehow help with mental illness is, I think maybe people think like, well, yeah, we know like psychology, we know therapy, sure, there's like a really important place for those fields, right? Of
course.
But I feel like that's why maybe psychoanalysis has always been interesting to me, because it's like a middle. It's like a middle zone. I think it does try to be. I think it does try to look at philosophical understandings of the psychology of a human being, the psyche, etc.
Oh yeah.
But it's like I think there's something about here's the deal. Philosophy has to do with basically like being motivated. Right, like there's a way in which it's like the love of wisdom, if we think of just the word itself, is to be, you want to learn, you want to seek out, you're interested, and one of the main things that happens with mental illnesses is there's a complete, just complete devastation for a person mentally of their motivation, right? Of their interest anymore in life, in the things that they use. You'll hear that phrase: the things I used to be interested in, like, are not interesting to me anymore. And there could be a real sense of like just helplessness in that position, because it's almost nobody wants to feel that way. Nobody wants to,
But how do you
be in that
motivate
position.
yourself
But
out
how
of
do you kind of get yourself out of that?
Right, if your whole problem is not having that.
Right. If your whole problem is, well, I don't have that interest right now, and then it's a double problem because it's kind of like I don't have that interest, and I know I should have this, and what's wrong with me? Why can't I just get out of it? Like, why can't I just? And you know, for people who try all of their coping mechanisms and none of that works, then there can be a real kind of at the end of one's rope kind of feeling to that.
Well, I think it is really important to associate philosophy with motivation. You know, Aristotle talked about first mover, final mover. There's this idea of mover and cause that are at the heart of the beginning of Aristotelian philosophy. And then even forms, in Plato, if you associate forms with the trajectory along which entities develop and realize themselves, like the orbit a planet follows, then there's something about trajectory that's very important. And I generally think questions of motivation, well, I actually think one of the things that got philosophy in trouble is that it started ignoring questions of motivation in favor of systemization, you know.
And also just the mere fact of it being completely hollowed out of anything interesting. I mean
basically, yeah.
Well, I mean, it's like, the thing is, even if you take like a really dry lecture of some philosophies, you know, professor at some college,
sure.
You know, the subject matter can be incredibly interesting, but somehow, I'm not trying to blame people, I'm not trying to blame professors or teachers.
Sure.
Maybe it's just the setting, maybe it's just the fact that nobody wants to be there, maybe it's the fact that, but like, it's like somehow this like incredibly fascinating and relevant information has become the most
because
excruciating thing to for people to just even want to want to learn about. Like, I guess it's just, to me, I almost feel like we've kind of stolen our own thunder in terms of motivation.
Sure.
And then we're wondering, why is everyone so depressed and sad and why is there the meaning crisis? Because I feel like somehow we have not valued intrinsic motivation.
Sure.
We don't actually know exactly how to cultivate that beyond possibly example and just encouragement.
Right.
So when you don't have intrinsic motivation, it's going to be hard to have this type of, like we're talking about, the philosophical motivation to want to seek wisdom, to seek, like, just to learn, to be interested in things, to be in, and to also remember that you are an interesting person yourself, that also the kind of in ratio with how interested you are, in a sense, right? And
well, so, there's a few things. You know, any study, any field that transforms the field into the history of the field becomes boring really quickly. When literature turns into the history of literature, when philosophy becomes the history of philosophy, when sociology becomes the history of sociology, it becomes extraordinarily boring because you're just memorizing facts and data and names. The history is often taught in a really boring way. It doesn't have to be, but history can be taught in a manner that's just memorizing names. Othello can be memorize the characters' names and what are the main plot points, which is a kind of like
following out or
kind of chronicling. You could say history or chronicling, you know, the chronicling of the plot of the story, whatever, as opposed to
like the measuring kind of
the measuring, or do you know the information of the plot? Like when literature becomes, do you know the information of the story, as opposed to the stakes of the story. Like, you know, if you come in, if you were to read Othello and then ask a class, hey, how would you not end up like Othello if you were in his situation, because all the evidence suggested that his, you know, Desimonas is betraying him. How would you not fall into that? You know, are you so sure you wouldn't? What is the nature of evidence and our experience of the world to make us so vulnerable to being tricked by an Iago? You know, what is the nature of life? Suddenly, Othello can become one of the most important things in the world because it might save you from falling into, say, a cult, a conspiracy theory, or a political movement, a totalitarian regime, whatever, and so forth. But if it's just, what was the name of the main villain? You know, what was the name of the main character? What year was it written? That's not going to help you avoid QAnon. And so the stakes are not there. Likewise, when you're talking about philosophy, when philosophy, you know, you're talking about motivation, which I think is very important, because we don't teach motivation anymore. You motivate people one of the great ways you motivate people is to cultivate an ability to see things as interesting or worth considering. Philosophy, therefore, is supposed to be cultivating the ability of seeing life as interesting. Instead, what we've taught people through philosophy is some really, weird thought experiments about a trolley. We've taught them that, you can't really trust anything because there's a counter-argument, and we've taught them really complicated and bulky systems, and we basically use philosophy either, one, to make people feel like everything they believe is stupid, two, to confuse them, or three, to use philosophy in the business of being right. So philosophy becomes a weapon of, argumentation, so you can, attack people, as opposed to a cultivation of a certain phenomenological towardness to life, where things become interesting or beautiful, because beauty also attracts, and worth considering. I think, Plato, Socrates, they said philosophy started with wonder. The beginning of philosophy is wonder. And if you don't have wonder, you don't have philosophy. So therefore, any philosophical classroom that is in the business of philosophy but doesn't cultivate wonder is not in the business of philosophy. It's a lie.
Yeah. It's a lie!
It's a lie! It's a lie!
Well, yeah, I think that's all really good, Daniel. I think, too, it's also probably just not to just sort of pigeonhole it simply to the philosophy classes or philosophy 101, but
sure.
Education in general is kind of erected upon, you will know this, and you will be tested upon, do you know this?
Yeah.
And then you get to real life, and you
don't know anything.
Yeah, you know jack. It's like, what? The shift from school, the basically, it's you are rewarded for knowing.
That's right.
And set up to feel like you can know.
Yes. As opposed to being taught how to respond to the unforeseen.
Yeah, and then you get to life, and there's just literally no clue. What am I doing with my life? Even people who seem like they know what they're doing.
They don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, they don't know what they're doing.
Unless you avoid... Now, one of the horrors, though, is you can know what you're doing by avoiding complexity, conformity, joining a political party that's going to save the world. That's one of the temptations, is to go somewhere where everyone around you, quote-unquote, knows what they're doing, when no one really does, but it becomes a kind of banality of evil that Hannah Arendt talks about.
Yeah, and in fact, the emphasis could possibly be better put on... maybe to be so certain that you know what you're doing is not the right thing to constantly for, 2.5 decades, reward and incentivize and reward and punish if you don't.
Right.
Because then you get to real life and you're like, well, what is this? Is this a punishment? I don't know anymore, and I don't know how to know, and I'm this by the previous structure. I must be failing.
Well, and I think it ties to your issue of motivation, because when you get to life and you don't know what you're doing, then you get disheartened because you've kind of been led all through life to have this kind of structure to motivate you to the next thing, and then you fall into depression or sadness.
Right, and even if you are doing it, where's your cookie? Where's your carrot?
Where's your cookie? So what's the point?
You have to basically value it in and of itself.
That's right.
And you don't have someone else telling you that it's necessarily, you may have if you're lucky, a supportive family who can encourage you or to motivate you in different ways, but that's not a given. And now too, with a more pluralistic society, it's harder to know what is the thing you should be doing at your age or whatever. Or it's either the two sides of that. There's either we don't have any kind of measures by which basically these processes of how do you
gauge,
kind of becoming a man, becoming a woman, all of those rites of passages, etc. We don't have those, but then on the other side, you're still going to get the social scripts of aren't you going to go back to school and things like that, which isn't necessarily bad, but it's just that there's a confusion, right? There's you're saying there's a confusion about and an oscillation between the extremes, I think. And I think that philosophy, what's so beautiful about it, what's so important about it is it actually says, no, we are going to dwell in the complex. We are going to complexify things intentionally. We are going to intentionally not know things. We are intentionally going to take what we quote-unquote know, and we're going to put ourselves in a posture of not knowing. And I think that's extremely important and valuable and practical, because in real life, you will actually encounter and feel on more occasions than not that you don't really know what you're doing. And really, instead of focusing on, do I know what I'm doing or not, just focus on what is before me. What is the work at my hand that I can put, what can I put my hand to and make better. Basically, like, what can I do that can make, literally just as simple as this. Like, my mom would always say this, you know, if you leave a place, try to leave it better. You know, like, if there's a piece of trash on the bathroom floor, it's a public bathroom, pick it up and wash your hands. You know, like, just try to make something better somehow.
Oh, yeah.
And so, I don't know. Those are the thoughts that come to mind.
Well,
now.
Well, you know, a few things. It's all very good. It is very hard to be motivated to live if nothing captivates you.
Yeah.
And it's hard to be captivated by something you already know, because you already know it. And so if education is to put you in the business of, you'll be successful in life if you know everything,
Exactly.
well, then it's setting you up to have no motivation. Because the idea is that the tract itself is motivating. Like, oh, you'll get a job, you'll get a promotion, you'll get retired. Like, all of that will function as motivations to get to the next stage. So you almost have two structures of motivation, generally speaking. The societal motivation is kind of stage-based. There are stages you can get to, and you look forward to those stages, and you go and you move. Well, what's happened is, you know, people don't really trust the American dream anymore. They don't believe retirement is possible for them. Like, you have a lot of people that have no savings at all. They also have been led to believe that they get taken advantage of by the stages. So the stages don't work so well.
Right.
Or they're not having the social contract. The social contract does not feel as reliable. Well, that means you have to have a different motivational structure, or else people are going to fall into disarray. And the philosophical motivation we're describing is a kind of motivation by wonder, by captivation, by wow. Isn't like, because you're talking about how philosophy will make things complex. It makes them complex precisely to make them new again.
Yeah,
to make them captivating.
It's not to simply frustrate. I think there can be something actually, and that would be a whole other topic. But I think there can be something that the human does actually enjoy about a certain level of frustration.
Oh, sure.
There is something that
they need challenge.
Yeah, like there is something that kind of is. We seem to desire some level of that in a progress, right? Like in a process. You don't just stay in the frustration, but it's almost like it ends up motivating in a sense, right? You get frustrated about something, or you are made frustrated, and it can provoke. And that can be almost like a flint, like a spark that can, you know, lead to.
It's hard to be motivated if nothing is challenging.
But the thing is, like, what's weird though is that isn't it super challenging to be dealing with, like, you know.
Oh, sure.
Just a complete dearth of feeling, like if you're having a depressive experience or season or very long, you know, it's kind of like, isn't that a type of frustration? You know,
well,
like,
most of the great...
Maybe it's different.
Well, most of the great problems in life have an ironic structure.
Yeah.
And, for example, very often people engage in temporary gratification to avoid X, and precisely because of the temporary gratification, they end up in X. It's something to put a pen on, and we've mentioned it before, as philosophy is very important because it's in the business of motivation. And motivation and the cultivation of new kinds of motivation is, I don't know if it's appreciated. I'm not going to say I've read all the literature and I'm, you know, a world expert on it. I'm not sure if the issue of motivation is taken with the amount of attention I think it deserves in the mental health conversation. Motivation. Oh,
absolutely.
And in family structures and in relationships, you know, if you have people struggling with motivation or to find motivation or to even kind of own their own motivating principles for life, that tends to lead into confusion, drama. You know, a lot of different problems can arise in social settings if you have people that don't know or own or have really paid attention to their own motivations. And that can cause all sorts of issues. And I think sometimes in the mental health, there is a discussion of, like, very important things, you know, family traumas, you know, what relationships are you in, how do people talk to you, how do you feel? These are all important. But if there's no questions of, okay, well, what are sources of your motivations? Do you operate according to stage motivation? Or do you operate according to wonder motivation, if we were to just use those phrases? Which, of course, what we talk about all the time is extrinsic motivation versus intrinsic motivation. And basically, our overarching argument is that when someone like Heidegger talks about new being, or the Dialogos conversations on new ways of orientation dwelling in the world, for me, basically, that's the movement from a society of extrinsic motivation to a society of intrinsic motivation. That the entire, it's a bold claim, and hopefully the books will make the argument, that basically what we're talking about when we talk about new being is a movement into intrinsic motivation. Because when you're intrinsically motivated, the way you live your life is entirely different than if you are extrinsically motivated in positive ways. But it can be hard because, by definition, it's going to be rejected by the social order because the social order is extrinsically motivated. It wants to... Anything the social order cannot make intelligible to itself, and this is an insight from Deleuze, it tends to antagonize and to not like. And almost by definition, the social order must antagonize intrinsic motivation because it will be personalized to every single individual who is so intrinsically motivated, and thus will not be easily intelligible, and thus the social order will not like it so much.
Yeah, no, definitely. And
which would maybe be why society has not developed this topic in mental health, because the society, it would be at risk of jeopardizing the social order if people were to address mental health issues in terms of motivation. Because you're like, well, you need to cultivate intrinsic motivation, and the social order is like, no, we don't like that. So then you get perhaps a de-emphasizing of that in issues of mental health.
Yeah, absolutely, right. Absolutely. And I think, too, going back to the idea of, let's just take a scenario of somebody who is really having a hard time, feeling depressed, feeling stressed, feeling overwhelmed, and they don't have... and there can be many reasons for that. A lot of times, obviously, the person is in a context, there are things that can be going into this. It's not like a person's just necessarily in a vacuum. Well, maybe they'd be maybe in a vacuum, they'd be like, I'm isolated, I'm alone. But the point of the matter is, it's always contextual, right? The person's always in a nexus of factors and circumstances and things, relationships, etc.
Sure.
Decisions, location, da-da-da.
Right.
But let's just take this person, and they don't feel any interest for life anymore, for whatever reason. And the idea of getting to revive this sense of having an interest in life, in the things of life, in just anything, let's just take anything, getting into some sort of hobby even could be a potential avenue out. I wonder if it's just a matter of having to do the motions until the feelings catch up or something. I mean, it's hard to say, and obviously we're talking about a highly it's very particular per person. There's also clinical situations and all of the neuroscience behind that. But the point of the matter is, it's just this idea that I wonder too if it doesn't help that it's hard because once the intrinsic motivation has not really been cultivated, it's hard to be able to just
turn it on,
or be able to connect with yourself. And sort of say, pick something that you used to like to do as a kid, just doodling. I mean, anything, and just sort of say, I'm just going to pursue this, or I'm going to do this, or I'm just going to, I'm going to put myself back into that place of the wonder or the excitement or the enjoyment. Maybe you won't feel it, but maybe if you kind of do the motions of having interest, I wonder, could that potentially possibly revive it? I don't know. I'm just trying to think on a practical level, how do you re-infuse interest into one's life?
Well, I mean, there's a few things. So that is getting into the million-dollar question of, can intrinsic motivation be taught and cultivated and incubated? If not, we're in trouble. I think there's reason to think it is innate because children just like to create. There is, in the same way that Rousseau and Hobbes would use state of nature thought experiments to kind of justify certain social orders, I think you can use a kind of quote-unquote state of childhood, if you will, to give reason to think that humans come into the world naturally interested in things.
Absolutely.
And I think it's better than Hobbes or Rousseau because it's like observable. It happens. You see it. Children are natural. The majority of children, maybe all children, seem to exhibit intrinsic motivation. And for some reason, most of them lose it or it goes away. But the very fact that you... Or it's, you know, pounded out of them by the system, sure. The very fact that you see that would give one reason to hope in the possibility of an intrinsically motivated society. But that would be a different question from once it is lost, can it be regained, and how, and what would the mechanisms be of that? That's a fascinating question I find very interesting. One of the things that I think is very important to it is you have to be able to basically just say, this, you know, you basically have to just say, I don't care what other people think, I'm doing it.
But we're kind of trained
to do the exact opposite.
Yeah, for one's entire life. It's pretty much it's a lot about pleasing people.
And it's like, oh, isn't it selfish to just be painting if it's not going to do anything and because you want to do it? There's all sorts of like these ethical systems that are created around not being intrinsically motivated, which then gets into the dangers of ethics that like a Nietzsche or whatever we'll talk about, and that's very, very true. And then of course the funny thing is, like if you're painting, people are like, well, why are you doing that? It's like, because I like it. Well, why? It's not going to get you a job. Why don't you come watch Netflix? You know, it's very interesting how people are so concerned about someone doing a project in their free time and then proceed to just
offer something consumptive and not creative.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with consumption. It's just very interesting because it's like, why? It's almost a sense of why would you put any effort towards something if it can't pay? And I think that's a great fallacy because one of the reasons you put effort towards something is precisely so that you have an intrinsic motivation that makes you want to get up in the morning. You are getting a pay because you're cultivating intrinsic motivation that makes you care to be alive. And maybe we'll move to the living room now because the kitchen doesn't look...
You don't want like the dishwasher sound?
You know, you hear that? I'm going to move so our audience is going to listen to this recorder move. You know, it's more like, you know, and that's our floor. Everyone can hear our floor. Maybe they'll feel wonder at the sound of our floor and will help cultivate philosophy.
Yeah,
this is what a creaky floor sounds like.
I love it.
That's right. That's the couch. This is, wow, the kids had a good time on the carpet. Different things. So now we're sitting. It's kind of interesting because people are like, why would you do it if
this is like the search for the little fish.
Oh,
that's why everything's been pulled out.
Wow, that was the most important toy in the world.
And she still hasn't found it. We haven't found it yet, but we will.
Oh my gosh. And she's intrinsically motivated to find that fish because she sees an intrinsic value.
And it's tiny. I was going to say, like, do any other moms just relate to like 98.7% of their day just looking for a tiny small toy or toy part? Like through all of the stuff, like having to find tiny... Anyways, this is hilarious.
Oh, they're a stickler for objects. I mean, you know, you have it's like, no, it's got to have that. It's that object, that thing. But it's funny because that ability to see a special value in a thing that to everyone else doesn't have
like
value.
Like a McDonald's toy or something.
Like a McDonald's toy. That is a kind of philosophical cultivation.
It is. And
of care. You know, Heidegger's care or whatever,
Yeah, I mean, and I was going to say, you know, I understand. It's more complex. It's more complicated. You know, the idea of pleasing people, there can be something good to that and something bad to that. The thing is that something we forget is that intrinsically motivated actions, okay? Or let me say this, cultivating intrinsic motivation toward pursuing something and building something for yourself or something that you are creating or engaged with or learning about, all of that, actually, it's weird because it can look very much like, oh, well, what are you doing for others or what are you doing for... You're even to get money, you know, all these things, but it's like it ends up actually being very pleasant, like, you know, people pleasing, all of that. It's a very pleasant thing to witness and to participate in, and it also offers something to other people that can please them. So I think there's something there's just a nuance to the idea of, you know, I think it's just that there's a big incentivization for, you did this right, you are praised. And that there's a place for that. I understand. You need to have like a functioning society where people understand right and wrong and all of that. But it's just that it can make people not attentive to why they like what they did, why they are interested in a certain thing. Not because anyone said good job or you should do that, but simply because wow, I find this fascinating.
Well,
And I think that that's being able to get back to that, like hearing what fascinates you, like what is interesting to you, is a very huge part of actually overcoming mental illness, because you can revive a sense of like why life is worth living. You know,
well, there's a few things. One, someone listening to this might be like, well, a lot of philosophers were depressed, suicidal, mentally unhappy, and different things like that. The issue is that the philosophy that we are stressing is a phenomenological cultivation of wonder, which is different than, I think Richard Rorty, when he said like philosophy is basically over, there was a kind of philosophy that indeed ended and should have ended, which is the establishment of certainty on terms of an overlay of what's called correspondence and coherence. So basically, ultimate grounding, a transcendent grounding to justify all our premises and prepositions and different things, which, someone like Kurt Gödel with the incompleteness theorem destroys. That kind of philosophy indeed ended. And the effort, and that depressed people, and also the idea of kind of getting a certain sort of secret of the universe by which everything could be understood. People felt like if they didn't, life wasn't worth living, and there were a lot of problems that came from that. So we're not saying that all forms of philosophy are necessarily good, but there have been glimmers of philosophy, say I think in phenomenology or aesthetics, or I've mentioned Aristotle, that have been different in character. And it seems like this kind of philosophy is the ability to see wonder and to be wondered and interested and to be motivated to be alive. To the point you're saying, Michelle, like when people are intrinsically motivated, there's this idea, it's selfish. Well, they tend to be more pleasant to be around. They have motivations that help them be more balanced. They don't get sucked into drama as much. They tend to be able to persevere through situations. They tend to have a different aura to them that becomes a gift to other people. So that's one of the great ironies, is we can fight intrinsic motivation as a society because we think it's selfish, when really it seems to help people be more self-giving, precisely by having that intrinsic cultivation. Like people like being around kids, generally.
Like at parties, they're just like, I'm just gonna go hang with the kids.
yeah, and the kids are intrinsically motivated.
I was gonna just joke, like the person who's intrinsically motivated working on their paintings, like they might not go to the mall with you to get like a cinnamon sugar Auntie Anne's pretzel or something like that. But I guess what I mean to say is like, I know that sounds like a silly example, but people do often use, and maybe this is just the idea that when we focus on, how do I put this? There's a way in which, when we think about it just in terms of, when we put the emphasis on what we can get out of other people. Versus what can we offer, and also what can we cultivate and enjoy about others. This is not to isolate everybody. This is meant to be like, intrinsic motivation should really be a very fruitful thing for people in communion with each other, in community with each other. But it does sometimes require trusting people, like trusting that, that person like is really into painting and they must have some reason. Like if you ask them to go to the mall, I'm just, again, it's a silly example, but like, and they say, I really would like to finish up this painting, to say, okay, like that.
Respect
to understand, to like respect that. Doesn't mean you can never can never kind of have a feeling of like, well, basically just to have the understanding. It doesn't mean that you'll never go to the mall with the painting person, but to be able to have some sort of respect and understanding. And also, I think people who are like people who are doing intrinsically motivated things and works, they also understand that about one another, like how valuable that is. So to make space for each other to have that time is valued,
Well,
like and not to say like a mall trip's necessarily bad at all, but it's just the idea that, I guess I was just talking about this idea of trust and understanding. But it's hard when, like, a lot of times the mainstream script can be more centered on consumption, right? On kind of the just sort of simply being a consumer. I'm doing things, which is, there's nothing wrong with doing things, but it's just that it's the idea of shifting it over to making things or learning things, which can come from doing things and experiences, but this idea of kind of being like consistently after certain ideas, it's just has to, I think it does take a certain level of understanding and trust.
capitalism hates intrinsic motivation. Absolutely hates it. And it is in the business of creating a value system of it that moralizes extrinsic motivation. You know, the whole thing is in that business. And of course, this is ironic because we proceed to argue that capitalism is at its best when there is a prevalence of intrinsic motivation. So there's an inherent irony to the system. But the point is that capitalism hates intrinsic motivation. You are not spending money when you are painting, dang it. When you're sitting, it hates conversation. Capitalism hates conversation. It's this thing you can have. If philosophers, for example, one of the things philosophy trains you to do is to be able to converse for an extended period of time at many subjects and to be interested and captivated. You have these longhand conversations emerging on the internet. They're like 3 hours, 2 hours, 4 hours, like nothing. Like nothing. People have constantly 2-hour conversations now. You'll see in these Dialogos spaces. Well, that's what philosophy can enable you to do. Yeah. And so you're not spending money. So it hates that. It doesn't want that. Because it's kind of free, right? It costs very minimum amounts of money to have conversations, and it's much less contingent. And this proves to be a great problem, and so it creates a value system around extrinsic motivation. And it also goes to show you, though, you know, where Deleuze is talking about how capitalism wants everyone to be intelligible and therefore people not to have their own line of flight. I don't know if human beings, it's not just capitalism, human beings don't like the people around them to not be quote-unquote intelligible. And the more people are doing intrinsic motivation, the more it's difficult to understand why that person wants to paint or what to do. You have to trust. So it's not merely capitalism that hates for people to have their own line of flight. Human beings don't like for the people around them to be doing something they don't readily compute. And so all of us contribute naturally to the quote-unquote capture Deleuze warns against, that he says capitalism is in the business of. Well, we all are in that business unless you are trained and conditioned by philosophy to respect intrinsic motivation and to engage in intrinsic motivation.
Yeah, it makes me think a lot about difference, you know, and kind of like Rilke's sense of the difference and the holding space for that. It makes me think about how it's interesting because, you know, it's all easy to talk about it until you really encounter difference.
Oh, yeah. And we don't like difference.
No.
Humans don't like difference.
No. And like, difference is hard.
Yes.
Difference occurs in the least likely places sometimes.
Oh, yes.
And in the places where you feel, where you desire the most safety and you desire the most ease and understanding. And that's where you find the difference.
Yep.
You know? And it can be very off-putting or confusing, I think, when you encounter difference in those places.
If it's not confusing, it's arguably not real difference.
Exactly.
You know, the initial encounter with difference almost requires confusion. And what you were saying it earlier, philosophy trains you to expect and to expect confusion.
Yes. And
to not respond to it poorly, and in fact to work through the confusion until you get to wonder and appreciation of the confusion.
Yes, and an appreciation for the difference. Now, I think this is the thing, though, because I know this seems odd, but I do see a difference here. There's a great other, I think, that occurs when you encounter an intrinsic motivation or an intrinsically motivated person. There is, because
there's an otherness.
Because
Absolutely.
It's not cultivated and really discussed.
Well, they're other because they're not operating according to the motivation that the society
right, they
is.
can't be captured. They're their own light of
there,
light.
There's an inherent otherness to them. Yes.
There's an inherent otherness to them, and that is both very intriguing and also very off-putting, depending on what you want necessarily. You know, what you may want from that other person, or what you may expect or desire, or whatever. Now, I think that, you know, obviously humans in communion and in community will sometimes need or have certain desires of one another or expectations or whatever. But the thing is that I think what intrinsic motivation and this kind of respect for difference does is that it allows you to understand that there's a place for all of these differences, in a sense, that are intrinsically motivated from the place of, again, it's hard to describe, but that place of hearing what is actually inside of yourself. It's a still small voice, the one that's telling you that, like, you know, you really should write that book about this.
Sure.
You really should, or whatever it is.
Sure.
Okay? But, like, there's a uniqueness to each individual in their voice that they can kind of propel them into their interest, right? Into their intrinsic motivation. And so what I mean to say is that when you encounter difference, it's very easy to just fold. It's like, this is hard. I'll just basically become exactly like the other person, make it easy. But then you end up not maintaining the beautiful difference that is actually, part of like a fuller human experience. And I think something that intrinsic motivation will lead to and does actually honor, I think. Well, so I guess what I mean to say is like there is you almost have to be intrinsically motivated to maintain not some sort of like, stubborn sense of self that is based off of like your ego and your false selves and your sense of your personality, your personality type. Okay. Sure. But when you are when you're like fast after and intrinsically motivated toward really kind of becoming, okay, then you are propelled by a true self, I do believe, in a sense. It's not like you'll be perfect or anything like that, but I think as you cultivate an intrinsic motivation and a work toward that, then the things that are coming from that, again, still small voice, should not really be ignored simply so that you can have homogenization.
Well, there's a sense in which we're talking about is the motivated self. There's the true self and the motivated self. And
are those the same? Are they different?
Well, this is what's interesting, is in some respects maybe the language of the true self has been problematic because that sounds like propositional knowledge that I have to learn and find. And why should I even care to find that, dang it? Like, what's the point? Who even cares?
Live,
I don't even want to live. Whereas when you start talking about how can you be a motivated self, that may help change the metric in a manner that would say, oh, well, how do I be motivated? And there actually is a very real sense in which, in that piece we did on the movie Drive My Car, it's this idea that it's almost can be problematic to think about the true self as opposed to engage in the self-forgetfulness. Because when you think about yourself, you're looking for something that you can never fully find. Or here's the problem. If you can find it, you must be able to translate it into terms that you can understand, which means it must be reductionist. Any quote-unquote true self you find is probably going to be reductionist because it has to be computable into terms you can understand. And that might be where you're making it linear and simplistic because the brain, it tends to be reductionist. It almost has to be reductionist to understand because even that chair over there is far more complex than my brain can actually take in all at once, or I have to reduce it to my immediate impression of it. However, there is a sense in which the phrase true self is accurate if we're going based on this idea of what seems to be the natural condition of human beings. Well, it seems as if human beings are born into the world and they're naturally creative and intrinsically, like we've talked about kids, right? Yeah. So there's a sense in what seems to be the true expression of what humans do is aligned with some kind of intrinsic motivation. What's interesting is that true self seems to come out when you're not looking for it, and instead you kind of forget about it and focus instead on moving, like the being motivation. A moving self. Because questions of who are you are different from questions of what motivates you. But here's what's interesting. Whereas questions of who are you may not entail questions of what motivates you, questions of what motivates you probably also entail questions of who you are, but it becomes a better metric by which to determine things. And I'll just, before passing it back to you, the trajectory of logic here is this idea that it would seem to be the case that when people are motivated, that goes a long way to combating mental illness. And motivated people seem to also be better in family situations, social settings. They tend to have a different aura and atmosphere around them. The argument that it would seem to be the case is that philosophy, when taken rightly, is in the business of motivation. Therefore, if you can cultivate in people, when people are asking, why do philosophy? Well, because it's in the business of cultivating wonder, cultivating motivation, of which can have very tangible and practical impacts on your ability to be in social settings, families, relationships, and mental health. Because as a thought experiment, it's hard to imagine there being much mental illness if everyone on the planet was interested. If they were interested in something all the time, it's hard to imagine there being much mental illness. So the question, mental illness. So the question is, can that be so cultivated?
Yeah, I guess the reason why I'm talking about the difference so much is because, well, one, like we said, people who are intrinsically motivated, at least in this particular, at least in most mainstream culture, are considered to be different.
Yeah, more intrinsic motivation equals more difference.
Yeah.
Which is very hard.
But I was also thinking that, you know, people who are in community with each other or communion with each other in anexes, you know, being motivated also may require you to rely on other people.
Absolutely.
Because you can't, you know, yeah, sure, like, I guess if you're like, you know, I don't know. It's always like there's always a nexus, right? There's always a reliance on, you know, also are you able to be making money, like, to pay your bills, or like, are you able to, you know, what are you doing right now? Like, are you to be able to pursue the things, okay, that are intrinsically motivated? Sometimes, sometimes you have to rely on other people.
Oh,
you know?
sure. Oh, sure.
It's weird. I guess what I mean to say is, like, there's something that can sound hyper individualistic about intrinsic motivation. But I'm trying to think about this more in the real life, which is like, we're in nexes, you know, we're in a constant, like, we're associating with, you know, like in a family dynamic, you've got children, you've got other people, family members, you've got other tasks, other responsibilities. You don't just have, like, I think the thing that I can think about with this is that intrinsic motivation can be a great thread for all of those, through all of those other things that you are also, you know, intrinsically motivated, or I guess what I mean to say is you care to do them, you know, and you're going to do them because they are your responsibility.
Well, in that talk with Ethan Nelson, we talked about how there's no value that if autonomous does not become bad.
Yeah.
Like, every value has to be in a network of other values. Intrinsic motivation, if you're just intrinsically motivated, well, you might be intrinsically motivated to do terrible things. Mm-hmm. You know, intrinsic motivation is not inherently good. Mm-hmm. But intrinsic motivation, because you could also be a loner and go off in the forest and you're intrinsically motivated to count leaves or something. That's great. Because leaves are pretty. But
as I said, it's like,
yeah, but Shell's like, close to home, close to home. You can't. It's like, seems like Daniel doesn't like difference. But intrinsic motivation, the issue is that, intrinsic motivation is a necessary value that has to exist in a concert of other values.
Yes.
Which is why, actually, it is hard, because it has to... Mm-hmm. Intrinsic motivation has to learn to exist amidst difference.
Yes.
That's kind of the negation sublation that we're talking about here.
But I think, too, like, you know, just... You know, real life example, like, if I am intrinsically motivated to do some, you know, recording on something, I may have to rely on you for 15 minutes.
Sure.
Like, hey, can you know, watch the kids? Or
sure.
I can sometimes do recordings when the kids are on. It depends.
Sure.
It really depends. But there is, as you get into more, you know, different roles of life, you have to sometimes be willing to kind of say, well, I know that you also have an intrinsic motivation to be doing X, Y, or Z, but these things have to work in concert, so sometimes you may have to put your one intrinsic motivation on pause to allow for the other intrinsic motivation to kind of do its work, and then that one's put on pause. But then also there's kind of like the intrinsic motivation at large of, like, wanting to raise children, you know what I mean? And so it's like, so it's always like there's kind of variables there, but the idea is that there's kind of it's just like we're saying, it's in the concert of all the facets of life, but the intrinsic motivation is able to, I hope, is able to reinvigorate a sense of, you know, again, why life is worth living, and why taking 15 minutes to do something is like valuable, because it also continues to fuel, it kind of is in a dialectic and a, how do I put this? It feeds off of one another. Like, it kind of helps to fuel one and the other, at least for me in mothering, to do creative works and to mother. Both I value, both I love. And so it's like, but if you kind of just don't listen to that voice that's saying, hey, you know, you should do, and that's, you know, me and Sam talked about that with, you know, Greener Side of Sam. It's like, why do a recording? There's like, no, why? It doesn't make you money, it doesn't, like, you know, you don't, but you still feel compelled. You feel compelled. And I think that's the type of compelling, this is the type of voice I'm talking about, that people for very long don't listen to. For very, very long in their lives don't listen to. And if you don't listen to it, reasonably so, obviously you're not going to be able to do recordings all day long, you know, but you could maybe do one for 15 minutes, and you'll find a reinvigoration in that, to be able to be even more present when you're doing your other intrinsically motivated work, which is to mother children, you know, to raise them. So...
Well, you said something very important. There's always good reason not to be intrinsically motivated, which actually suggests why reason alone is dangerous. Because there's always good reason not to be intrinsically motivated, and then one day you wake up and you're not intrinsically motivated, and you no longer have extrinsic motivations to support you like you once did, and what now?
Exactly.
The point you're getting at suggests the role, a role of non-rationality, not irrationality, non-rationality, where you basically choosing to engage in intrinsic motivation can have a non-rational, is more non-rational than extrinsic. Now, you could argue it's rational after listening to our talk, because we've, given you an evidence, but there's something about it that is very non-rational. And, intrinsic motivation is not inherently good. I mean, you could argue that people in Japan who have locked themselves in the room, the origami, where they've locked themselves in their apartment and they never leave, they're intrinsically motivated to play video games. But, it would be interesting, actually, to ask if that's intrinsic motivation or just constant stimulation. There actually could be some maybe parsing out between those differences, where a lot of what is isolationism that you could say is intrinsic motivation actually is not, that it's more stimulation, but that would be a different topic. But what I wanted to say is, so you don't cultivate that intrinsic motivation, and you wake up one day and you don't have it. And basically, the thing you have to understand is that the moment you are born, you are in danger. And what I mean by that is you're in danger of not cultivating intrinsic motivation and therefore perhaps falling into mental illness, or you're in danger of cultivating intrinsic motivation and becoming less intelligible to the people around you, and then isolating yourself because you don't want to deal with difference, and then you go into those trouble. The moment you're in this life, the game is on, in a sense. There is risk, and you have to figure out how to dialectically think. That's a key phrase. Dialectically think between, okay, I need to be intrinsically motivated, but I also can't separate myself from difference, because it's much easier to be intrinsically motivated if you're outside the social order. But once you do that, you've run from the social order, which has a necessary negation to it to sublate you into higher forms of being and absolute knowing, as described in Hegel. The moment you isolate yourself from society, sure, that's a antithesis from extrinsic motivation, but now it's going to be an effacement instead of a negation, as we talk about in our book, because now you are separated from the social order that actually that intrinsic motivation needs to plug into to be a new being, quote unquote, and to contribute to the arising and emergence of a new being in the social order. So you have to put yourself in that encounter with difference, but that gets to your point. The irony is the more people are intrinsically motivated, the more intense the difference becomes, which will make it more difficult to hold the ground, if you will, and to make it more tempting to isolate, but you've got to hold. And philosophy will have an increasingly important role to convince you that there's reason to do this and to navigate that difference by analyzing it, thinking it, meta skills, all those things we've talked about, understanding how irony works, all the hermeneutics, all these different things. And philosophy will keep you there in that place of difficulty and to see good in it, as opposed to just fleeing into isolation.
Absolutely. No, I think that's so good. And I think one thing I was going to say, or well, maybe three, but the one thing is that I do think something really great about philosophy is to celebrate that we don't know.
Absolutely.
And that's truly, even just if somebody just, if that's something that one can think on regarding philosophy, I think it would be, hopefully worthwhile, because a lot of times the position that people are toward the unknown is just utter anxiety, fear, and depression, and so it's philosophy, this is a space, this is a really wonderful space, and there is a legacy of celebrating the unknown. This is not to say that the unknown is something you necessarily there are types of unknowns, sure, that you don't necessarily want to stay in too long. There's a kind of interesting kind of coming in and out of the unknown, right? And obviously we use language. We're always using some sorts of knowns. You're always having some sort of givens within the ungiven or the unsure, right? The unknown. But I think that what I mean to say is that you're not alone. You're not alone, and you've got a really wonderful, I want to say safe place or safe space, but there is a real there's a kind of sense of safety in the unsure, and finding kind of that ability to find the others who have been through the sufferings and the existential crises and the things that bring upon, the mental illnesses and the mental destabilizations that are there, who have written. This is why books are so valuable. You're not alone in some of the things that you've been dealing with. Yes, of course, nobody is you particularly.
Sure.
But there are others who have wrestled with the questions of existence. And you know, I think that's a wonderful thing to find, and to be able to say, you know, let's actually find a place of you know, getting excited actually about the existential.
Yeah, basically. And a few things.
And then I'll say one more other thing, but go ahead.
Something I meant to mention earlier that I think is very important. I think sometimes the word depression is used to do too much, because there seems to be a big difference between, say, a depression that emerges from a trauma, say as a child you were beaten, and a kind of philosophical, dare I say, depression that emerges from, like, what's the point of being alive? Like a melancholia kind of thing, which seems different. And it would seem, you know, the kind of depression and mental illness that we're describing seems to be this growing, you could say it's the meaning crisis, but the depression that cultivates the meaning crisis seems different from trauma-based depression, but we tend to kind of use that term as an umbrella for a lot of different things. But if there's this lack of motivation depression that seems to be melancholic, that seems to be metaphysical, you could even say, this kind of metaphysical depression. There's a term that is missing that seems to be really needed, that I think if it exists, it would help sort of say, oh, well, yeah, that philosophy is indeed a mental, in a way, contributes to mental health, because it deals with this philosophical melancholia, or this motivational melancholia. Again, I always think it's quite interesting. You know, the 7 deadly sins, people talk about sloth. That was a terrible translation, because sloth is lazy, but really the word in Latin starts with an A, and I can't pronounce it. It means more like philosophical melancholia, like a state where you don't see the point.
You know, who wants to hate on sloths anyways? I mean, sloths are so cool.
Yeah, the kids like it. You know, Haven loves sloths. There's this kind of, like, the 7th deadly sin is something like this philosophical melancholia, this lack of motivation that comes not from, say, a trauma where you don't trust people, but and you're like, what's the point, because it'll just hurt you.
I think there's still a trauma there, Daniel. I think there's still a trauma there, because I think I understand it's a very severe word, and I don't want to use it lightly. I really don't. But there can be a type of something traumatic about basically being desensitized to the voice that's within yourself.
Sure, but I think that is a form of trauma, but technically, you know, they use the word trauma to mean particular things.
Sure. So, sorry, that's over.
It's perfectly fine. But there's a kind of philosophical melancholy that, well, and here's the issue. Arguably, whatever this philosophical melancholy is, cannot be addressed by traditional therapy in psychology, because those are not going to be looking at metaphysical groundings of being, or your ability to have phenomenological aesthetics in different things. You know, they're going to be dealing with more on the emotional side, which is very important if you've said you'd had family abuse, because that's what you have to work through. But if you're dealing with philosophical melancholy, philosophical melancholy may correlate with great families, precisely because you have these great families, you have no reason not to be motivated, and yet you're not motivated. So, you know, and that was something like a Durkheim mentioned within his book on suicide, where suicide correlates with not poverty, but wealth, is the exact opposite of what people think. And so, you know, whereas what would help people deal with mental illness based on trauma from a place of, say, family abuse or different things, would be a mismatch on people that are dealing with, say, this philosophical melancholy, which would mean you would need to go into the business of philosophy, that people have not been doing.
Yeah, no, that's very good. That's very good. I was also going to say, I think, we were talking about, like, what, you know, can somebody just be intrinsically motivated to play video games? You know, not that there's anything wrong with playing video games necessarily, but the idea of, like, you know, being like an all-consuming type of engagement or something like that, where they're maybe not functional or not able to, you know, in some ways, I mean, a lot of, playing video games is fine, but it can be an escape, obviously, if it's used.
Yeah, there's some sort of difference there.
But I was thinking, maybe it could be helpful to understand, you know, what exactly do you mean by intrinsic motivation? Sure. I think of it as, like, we're talking about being motivated to find the wonder, to see the wonder in life.
Yes, I think that's critical.
To have the eyes to see the glimmers of eternity, as we discussed, and things like that. To be able to be fast after things just because you're interested in them. You know, and making a project out of, you know, something you want to create, you know, not simply making people your projects or something like that, which I think people always have this drive, but they end up this can just be a source for drama, because then it ends up being like an intrinsic motivation to kind of fix somebody else's life or something like that. And
Sure.
I understand, like, that would be a whole different discussion, but the thing is that they're the aims of that, right? Like, in a sense, you almost there can be a way in which what is it kind of aimed towards actually offering, you know, and I think intrinsic motivation does kind of create something that potentially one can offer.
I mean,
now, and the idea of somebody like wanting to fix somebody else's life, you know, I'm not talking about just people like lovingly giving advice or, you know, caring for one another or helping one another. I mean, really making people a project, like thinking, you know, what's best for them and trying to, you know, make them conform to that. That would not be a good thing to be doing, and maybe that would not. Maybe would be like, well, you can't have intrinsic motivation for that, because you're kind of using externalities as your like accomplishment versus something within that kind of comes out. But I think people do feel very motivated towards just doing certain things that can be actually not very good and very harmful for relationships and very harmful ultimately for themselves. So I'm just trying to narrow down the definition of intrinsic motivation.
Well, I mean, you have to go case by case,
sure,
I mean, paper by paper. I mean, arguably that's not intrinsic motivation, because you're motivated by an extrinsic result that you see the other person conform to.
Mm-hmm. So it kind of boils down more so to, you know, being again, the motivation toward the wonder and creation, I think.
Well, you know, a few things. So first off, there's a difference between, say, finding your identity in micromanaging other people. There seems to be a difference between an over-attachment to your identity and living, because that's like your true self that you're conforming to, where you're not intrinsically motivated, but you're instead looking to make things match up with how you think they're supposed to be. There's not really a motivating as if a going forth, but a kind of comparison that is going on, whereas and there seems to be a difference there.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, I mean, the fate of beauty is basically the whole notion is that the intrinsic motivation that we're talking about is beauty-based and wonder-based, and the ability to see wonder in life, and that's the main source of intrinsic motivation. Also, intrinsic motivation must be non-conditional. It must be very, very non-conditional, and if you require there to be other people whose lives you can change and manage, there's a certain condition that must be met. You have to have other people that you can manage. So there's a lack of intrinsic motivation there. Also, too, like you say, with the video game thing, if you're playing all the day to escape life, then you don't see wonder in life. You enjoy a certain stimulation. And that's also arguably not an intrinsic motivation, because you are extrinsically motivated by the video game. You know, the video game is pushing you forth.
There's something creating out of nothing.
There's something, this is where it comes to, yes. And there's something very ex nihilo about intrinsic motivation.
Yeah,
like if you take a story like Turn the World of the Sword of Tribulation, that the thing that is stimulating you is inside of you. Mm-hmm. You know, it's in a sense, if the video game is inside, you see the movie, you see it, but it's not in the world at all. But you see it and you bring it into the world. There's something about directionality. Yes, there's something about directionality where extrinsic motivations are outside of you and come into you, whereas intrinsic motivations are inside of you and go out of you. Now, of course, they overlap.
Sure.
But there's something about you are the first mover in the thing.
Yeah, and see, that's, you know, that's really good. And, you know, obviously, like, that doesn't bode well for capitalism, you know.
No.
And also, I think too, that, I think a lot about children, obviously, thinking about our own children, and intrinsic motivation in children is also demonstrated in energy, in ambitious goals to, you know, make a real robot, things like that.
They want to see a real fire.
They want to make a fire. Gosh darn it. And
it's not in the world, and they want to make it in the world.
Exactly. They want to put it in the world. And I think we have to cultivate and encourage in parenting to embrace that.
Yes.
I mean, I'm not saying that you can necessarily do the fire at that exact time when you're about to sit down for dinner and it's raining, you know.
Yes.
But it's like, but I think that people, you know, we talked about this the other day, you know, people a lot of times associate, like, you know, basically good behavior and being intelligent with, like, not being bothersome.
Yes.
And people are bothered by intrinsic motivation. I frankly think that they are, because again, it's unintelligible to them.
It's unintelligible.
They can't really make sense of it. They don't know why it's being done.
Yes.
Da, 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 da. This is children.
Yes.
There's kind of like, why do they, why, and why do you want to do this particular, why are you so adamant that we do this particular thing right now? And obviously there have to be certain boundaries.
Yes.
You can't do all the things that all the kids want to do all the time. But I think there needs to be a place and an encouragement for how we engage with children that is to honor the fact that they have this intrinsic motivation. This is a very beautiful thing. This is a very powerful thing. And we need to be able to encourage, wow, that's so cool. I know that, like, to encourage their fascination, to say, yeah, that's really cool when that happens, or that would be really neat to see. We can't do that right now, but let's do it at this time, or let's do it next week, whatever it is, where you honor the sense that they have this drive. And yes, can it feel, it's just like people don't want to be bothered. It's almost like people can't be bothered, and yet everyone's bored and depressed. It's like, maybe we should let ourselves be bothered more often. I don't know. You know what I mean?
We get shook out of our dogmatic slumber,
Yes,
out of our,
please.
like, Kant.
So I
Well, if you did,
I just think this it ties in a lot to me, to how we just view this, and children are a prime example of intrinsic motivation.
well, another way to put this is extrinsic motivation is causality, where intrinsic motivation is creation. You are extrinsically motivated if the prime factors of motivation are caused. They're caused unto you. There are things causing you to do certain things. So you turn on the video game, the dopamine rush happens in your brain, so you're being caused to be engaged with it. Whereas something that's more creative is there is no fire. As a child, there's no fireplace, there's nothing. But you imagine the possibility of one because you read something in a book. Mm-hmm. But even the image of the book, you can say, well, the book caused it. Well, no, because you took the information and then you envisioned a world in which a fire actually existed on your driveway. So you took it from an abstraction, imagined it as something concrete, and now you want to create that concretion. And so it's more creative. Now, of course, they overlap because humans are this bothness being where we are a mixture of cause and effect, causation and creation, high order causality, low order causality, so they always overlap. Because the moment you create it, here's the trick, the moment you create a fire, it could then cause someone else to do something. Like, it is now in cause and effect. The moment something is created, it is now a causal agent. So it then suddenly seems like it was always a causal agent. That's the problem. If you are intrinsically motivated to do X, the moment X is done, X becomes extrinsically motivating to others. Or to yourself. So there's always this becoming, it's like Heidegger, kind of that concealment, that clearing notion, where the moment something is done, it conceals something. The moment something is cleared, it's hiding something else. There's this double action that occurs that makes it confusing and difficult to pinpoint.
That makes me think that comparatively, consumption is very clear. Like,
sure,
something was there, now it's not.
Yes.
But then again, it's like, why is it not there? Doesn't consumption make its own externalities and cause and effect?
Well, so for example, you consume the book, which was extrinsic to you.
It was delicious.
It was a delicious
I just had this image of actually eating a book.
But this is why we can't say consumerism. We've said it in other talks. Consumerism is not inherently bad because consuming chronotrigger could inspire you to do this sort of tribulation, right? You create from the consumption.
And also, and like the intrinsically motivated rely, in a sense, like a painter, they hope people will see their work. I mean, not necessarily, they don't do it just for people looking at it. But
sure, a lot of the difference seems to be directionality. Like, do you consume and then direct it into you and out of you as something new, or to in you to push you forth, or do you just consume it and it stays in you?
Yeah.
Like, do you consume and it sits like a rock?
Yes.
Or do you consume and it pushes because you then internalize it in a manner?
Yeah. And I know Dr. Niedenhauser has talked about the idea, and it's probably a readily understandable idea in philosophy, the idea of learning, only learning in order to create, really.
Yes, well, the Shelley.
Yes, exactly. That quote,
yes,
I love it. Drew will overlay sometimes from who has a really cool jiu-jitsu place.
Oh yeah.
We'll overlay some quotes or passages.
Oh sure.
With jiu-jitsu, it's really cool. So he had done that, and it just really stood out to me, and I was like, that's so powerful, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of that recording I did on scrolling.
Oh yeah.
Where it's we do end up consuming, and it just sort of it just sort of stays inside. And I think, you know, if anyone is finding, because it can really be a cause for lethargy or sort of sluggishness, or this melancholia of the philosophical melancholy, I think that even just to start with, like, let's keep the ratio the same. For as much time as I scroll through my phone or whatever, I'm going to use that much time to make something, to do recording, to do a watercolor painting, to go. I mean, yeah, sure, maybe somebody's like, well, I'm really not artistic, go for a run. It takes the same amount of time and go do something with your body, do something with yourself, make something. Call your grandma. I mean, just kind of doing something that kind of offers or creates, I think. You know what I mean?
You want to be your mover. You do not want to say, you should be the prime agent in how you feel. And what I mean by that is when you're going, I'm bored, I want to feel good, therefore I'm going to go to the movie theater. Well, you therefore need the movie theater to quote-unquote feel good, or to feel like life is exciting or something, or worth doing. It is so important to be able to be your own source of quote-unquote feeling good, if you will, like feeling that life is good. And if not, then, you know, you're at risk of, one, needing, you know, if you don't have the money to go to the theater, you're in trouble. But then also to eventually one day wake up and go, wow, I can't be my own source of feeling good. I need something external to myself. What's wrong? You know, well, there you go. Now you're in the melancholy, because you come to realize that you're incapable of making yourself feel like life is good. And when I say feel good, I tie that with wonder. You're not able to see things as interesting and wondering. So philosophy is massive to the question of human motivation. And before I forget, you were talking about the unknowable. You know, philosophy makes, you know, we get excited.
Celebrating the unknown.
It occurred to me that language might suggest the difference between this new philosophy that they're describing and the old philosophy that seems to have actually contributed to depression and suicide and all these different things. There seems to be a difference between unknowability and unknown. Where philosophy, after Kant notably, got in this business of, the noumenon and the phenomenon, there are things you cannot know that are unknowable, you know, that are across the noumenon you can't know. And then there's this kind of idea that there was all sorts of things that are unknowable. Well, if they're unknowable, what's the point? You know, why even try? And so philosophy went down this kind of rabbit hole of defining things as unknowable, and then everyone, you know, we all misread Hegel, and I think that would have fixed it, but we missed all that. And then we went down, okay, well, we're going to get like a system through Fitch, and then Bertrand Russell with Principle of Matter, and then you reach Godel, and it's like, yep, it's unknowable, you can't get a perfect transcendental grounding, and then we went into postmodern deconstruction, all that, where it's all about, all of that has been screaming unknowability, that philosophy is in the business of saying that there are things that are unknowable. But when you say there are things unknown, well, that's exciting. We don't know everything. There's things yet to be known. There's hope.
I think
whereas unknowability kills hope. The unknown is exciting. It's dangerous. It could be Lacan's The Real, but it also could be beautiful. You know, the beautiful, the real, there's something to discover. And guess what? That also means if there's always something unknown, that means you never have to worry about your brain ever knowing too much, per se, or knowing so much that it leaves you bored, because there's always something else to know. So I think, again, what you're getting at is that philosophy messed up because it got in the business of tracing out the caveats of unknowability. Whereas what we're describing is getting philosophy back in the business of appreciating and finding hope in, interest in, and wonder in the unknown, which gives us work to do.
Yeah, and the great thing about that is it's a process, right? It's a movement through the unknown to revelation.
Yes.
Honestly, it's a constant revealing.
Oh, yes.
Always more you're learning, and always more you have yet to learn. It's a very beautiful dialectic between those two. I think the Kantian sense would make it to where there's the unknowability that also you would be, you know, it's kind of made out to be like, if only you could know it. I mean, you know, it's like there can be this desperation, almost a forbidden fruit concept of like wanting it and not being able to reach it, and the frustration, the staying in the place of frustration, okay? And then it becomes defeating. And then you just become very, very sad, you know?
Yeah, I mean, there's Wittgenstein's like philosophy, kick the light, you know, what we cannot speak, we must be silent. There's all this sort of unknowability language.
Yeah. Whereas, like, it's it's the constant revelation, the constant kind of re-examining, right? Rethinking, keeping yourself open to even knowing again, or knowing for the first time. Well, I want to say first time. Knowing again might be a good way to put it, or seeing something once again, or something new, or something beyond your idea of even a person before you. You know, I think it's that place of the. I think that's a good point that you make, and I think there is a difference between that. You know, there's a difference between those two types of philosophy. You know.
Well, if I say the mountains over there are unknowable, well, then you say, okay, well, no reason to try to climb them. But if I were to say the mountains over there are unknown, ooh, you know, suddenly it's an adventure. Suddenly there's like, oh, they're unknown. No one's been there before.
Like an invitation?
It's an invitation. You know, again, what you're pointing at is, you know, we've mentioned it before, Flannery O'Connor's notion of a mystery. A mystery is something, the more you know, the more there's left to know. It's an ever learning, not a
ever-learning.
You know, it's an ever learning as opposed to
it's like an evergreen, but it's ever learning.
Yeah, it's ever learning. A mystery is an ever learning. And, you know, we talk about in the philosophy of glimpses, like this notion of the iceberg or the mystery of the ever learning. Philosophy has been in the business for about 200 or so years of not ever learning, but putting limits on what we can learn. And there's some validity to that. There's some validity to distinctions. It's good to know if you can't lift 500 pounds, for example, before you break your back or something. But where philosophy has stayed there, what we're seeing now is the need to negate unknowability and to negate a philosophy of unknowability and sublate it into a philosophy of the unknown, which then is an invitation, which is then a hermeneutics of excitement as opposed to a hermeneutics of suspicion, and can become motivating. Because if you are to say if I look at you and I say life is unknowable, you know, we go, oh, that's kind of sad. But if I look at you and say there's a lot to life that's unknown, that can make life very different and very new.
Yeah, well, I think there's a shift there, right? On the unknowable is basically just like, you're stupid.
Yeah, that's basically
like you can't.
You're dumb.
You'll never be able to.
Yeah. So why? So
right,
of course you sit down and say, all right.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas the unknown gives it's a quality to that which is it's strange. It's actually this recognition of the unknown that's out there in a sense, right? This is interesting because there is a way in which, not to complexify intrinsic motivation too much, but there is something that's kind of always, even if it's intrinsic motivation, there's something about we live with a phenomenological perception of the world. There's always some sort of extrinsic or external, right? That then is kind of
phenotypical, yes.
Yeah, that's kind of basically in a feedback loop, or kind of like reciprocity. There's a reciprocity between those two things for the intrinsic motivation. You know, it's kind of also like the idea too that that basically like your motivation, which you kind of decide, like, I'm gonna do paintings, let's just take that example. There's a way in which perhaps, like, we're talking about this idea of how does one get from the place of not being interested in anything anymore to being interested in beauty, inspiration. There's kind of a re-breath, right? Inspiration, a breathing in a sense to revive life, like almost like CPR or something like that. That those moments of inspiration can revive the intrinsic motivation. It's something. So there's always this kind of dialectic, I think, between the external and the internal. Basically, is all I'm saying. It's just that the motivation comes from, you know, basically you saying to yourself that this matters, not somebody else, you know, only doing it because someone else says it matters, basically.
Well,
so just, because anyways, the quality is that the outside world and the outside ideas, or these things you can reach and be revealed and that are mysteries, have the quality of unknown, and therefore it's not on you that you just can't know. It's actually that the things that you are still yet to discover are unknown, but constantly being revealed.
Well, if I look at someone who's intrinsically motivated and I say, well, they're unknowable, well, they're a freak. But if I look at them and say that intrinsically motivated person is unknown, It could be, oh, well, we need to listen to them. Oh, well, let them do their thing so we can know them.
That's interesting. I always feel like unknowable. It's almost like it's almost like unintelligible, right? Like unknowable means it would almost be like if something was in a completely different language. You know, it might be fascinating to look at or something, but it's like you actually just can't read that.
Sure.
Whatsoever. So then again, there would be like, I really can't try even. I can't make this understandable to myself.
Oh, sure.
Right? Versus it being like a novel, you know, like something where it starts where you see just the beginning of the letters, but the further you go along, the more you see.
Well, an intrinsically motivated person, when you say they're unknowable, well, then they can't become increasingly intelligible. But when you say they're unknown, there's the possibility of increasing intelligibility, or something being birthed into the world that you'll be glad, that you couldn't have known ahead of time, that you'll be glad when it comes into existence.
Yeah. I guess I'm just wondering if people would just simply conflate those. Like they'd say like, oh, well, unknown is just as unknowable. Yeah, you know.
Well, the argument we're making is they have, and that's what's been devastating.
Right. So to make this distinction would be just to emphasize that the quote unquote unintelligible intrinsic motivated person is not an unknowability, right? They are an unknown.
Well,
they are a surprise, basically.
Well, perhaps the unknown is unknowable, but you have to try first.
That's true.
You have to be open
and
to
maybe
that.
At that stage of your life or where you're at, like you are not ready or not able to, and that is okay.
Unknown
but
is
it's always
open.
the open, right? The willingness.
Yes, unknown is, if we use that language of a hermeneutics of the unknown is open, a hermeneutics of unknowability is closed.
Yeah.
You know, if I look at that chair and say that chair is unknowable, like everyone does after Kant, we say, oh, well, okay. But if I say that chair over there is unknown, you might go, oh, why? You know, why is it unknown? Has nobody asked questions about it? You know, in what sense is it unknown? You know, actually, the point that chair over there is unknown kind of invites a whole slew of questions. Whereas if I say that chair over there is unknowable, the conversation's over. And a philosophy of unknowability, which seems to be what the majority of modern philosophy has been, is of course contributed, therefore, to the meaning crisis.
Well, right, and it undercuts, like the word contains, ability.
Yes.
Right? It undercuts ability. A big thing that makes people not as intrinsically motivated is to basically just make people feel like, well, you can't.
They don't have ability.
Yeah, you can't do that. And also, like, this is the thing. This is why I think it goes back to, I'm thinking about children. And yes, you will have to tell children they can't do certain things, like climb on the roof or whatever it is. But I think that if it's a constant barrage of, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't. Okay, well then, no wonder they tell themselves that too.
Yeah.
They tell themselves what they also hear. And so, you know, especially if it's just kind of a proclamation and there's never really any kind of explanation or elaboration on why a particular thing is a can't. And there are sometimes can'ts. I'm just saying there does also needs to be a space for can, and that's interesting. And let's try that.
Well,
you know, because the thing is that people will still be driven to do that, and that's why I think too, like this can manifest in people's life later on with like, because they felt such a suffocation of can't. They still have a desire. Actually, I think we all have this intrinsic motivation. Okay, I'm gonna not go into crazy land too much with this, but what I'll say is this: the can't means that they look for a can elsewhere. That can be that can manifest as rebellion.
Well, they usually do.
Yeah.
Well, when you
and then like that only gets more like kind of basically like that's just bad, and that, you know, is, I think like yeah, obviously like rebellious acts can be bad and wrong, but the thing is that we have to see kind of what's underlying that. And I think a lot of times there's a desire to create, there's a desire to experiment, to learn, to do.
Well,
you know, and it's kind of like, can we funnel that towards like, you know, substantive things or things that people are interested in that are, you know, beautiful, good, true, you know, like.
Well, there's a few things. First, people are told the social order says you can't do this, you can't do that, you have to get a job, you can't create, you can't do that, and then people look to philosophy, and philosophy's like, oh, and you can't know anything either. So then they're like, well, fine, and then you have a meaning crisis. What were you trying to say?
Well, just simply that. I mean, I don't need to continually make the disclaimer. Obviously, there are things you can't do. You know, can't go 150 on the freeway. You know,
sure.
But it's more just a disposition toward curiosity. Okay, toward interest. Toward interest. That's simply what we're talking about. Interest in certain things. Interest in And a lot of times it's just like it doesn't quite fit with the system, or it doesn't quite fit with the schedule, or if it doesn't quite, and yes, you can't be like thrown out completely with rhythm or whatever, but it's just there are certain things that people have an interest for at a younger age, but it doesn't quite fit with the curriculum, or it doesn't quite fit with this, or doesn't quite fit with that. You know what I mean? And so maybe they can find time to do that in spare time, but it's just...
Well, it would be a different sort of, but there's a few things. One, if you let people do their curiosity, and they were to actually succeed in that, well, that would, one, reflect back on you if you didn't follow your curiosity, so there's an existential level. Also, if it was possible for kids to, in their own, or people, follow their own curiosities and succeed, there might be an argument to be made that the current system is immoral. And so in order to stop the arising of that moral consideration, which, if it doesn't arise, you can have plausible deniability, you therefore systematize not allowing there to be examples of successful curiosity, which would possibly lead to a moral reflection on the entire legitimacy of the system. Now, that would, because actually a lot of systems are in the business of managing the examples that they allow that would have, quote-unquote, moral ramifications on that system.
Right.
So you have to control your case studies so that you can exist in a state of plausible deniability. But, to what you're saying, when we talk about this difference between unknown and unknowability, a child is like, I want to build a fire because I don't know yet what it will be like to build a fire. Mm-hmm. I don't know yet what kind of place the world will be where there's a campfire in my driveway. Because
it's a place where we're making s'mores.
Yeah, basically, which is a good use of a campfire. Because the unknown...
That's the real reason. We went roast marshmallows.
The interesting thing about a philosophy of the unknown is what is unknown could be the yet to be known. It could be the unknowable, which you try to know it and find out you can't know it. It could be the best left not known. It could be the best discovered. There's a whole lot of possibility that opens up when you emphasize the unknown, all of which then creates a question. What are you going to do? And then you're motivated by that question to respond.
Well, there's an interesting dialectic between the known and the unknown, too.
Yes.
You want to make that fire for whatever reason.
Yes. Yes.
You would like to make the fire so you can roast your marshmallow.
Yes, you want to make it, but you don't know what it's like in its concretion.
Yeah, you don't know what it's like. You don't know if it's going to work out this time, or if it's going to last long enough to roast your marshmallow.
Yes.
Or what it will look like, or if this amount of sticks would build a big enough fire.
Well, what you're getting at there is this very fascinating dialectic or interplay between the unknown and the known motivationally.
Yes.
Where it seems they need each other because you know you want to know the unknown.
Exactly.
And you're therefore motivated to realize the unknown, which if you didn't know that there was an unknown, you wouldn't be motivated. But if you also knew the unknown, you wouldn't be motivated.
Yes,
so
it's that tension.
Yes, you require the tension.
You require the tension. And that's why making everything for so long be a sense of either you can't know it, right? The unknowability of Kant and that type of philosophy, or the sense of here's your prepackaged knowledge that you should know and we'll test you at the end of this.
And that everyone already knows. It's not new. You're just trying to conform.
Yeah, you're just trying to make sure you know this, what did I call it?
So there's no unknown,
Yeah, there's really no unknown. I mean,
There's unknowability and known.
Yeah.
There's no unknown.
Exactly. And there's no tension between the known and the unknown, where you have this, I know I want to experience the unknown. And as you experience it, the more you realize how much you don't know yet.
And motivation seems to require tension. There almost by definition has to be a tension to be motivated.
Yeah.
And, it could be the tension, even if we're talking the video game, it could be the tension of not playing the video game yet and wanting to play it. But there's something even between extrinsic and intrinsic that involves tension. And therefore, for intrinsic motivation, you have to create a tension in yourself, which of course is uncomfortable.
Well, that's why I think, actually, when somebody's dealing with mental anxiety or depression or other things, that's not, in experience, that can be horrible, but there is also a way in which there's an indication that this could be potentially a place of tension that you could actually utilize as a springboard as a springboard to this known unknown tension. You can use that as a springboard.
Well, it's like with the talk with Lorenzo. There's something very interesting
into creating, literally, like just. Oh, anyways,
I mean, in the book Touched by Fire, or with the talk with Lorenzo on bipolar and how a lot of creative people also were mentally divergent and different things. There is something very interesting to be said that mental divergence and creativity tend to go together, and that the ability to channel mental divergence is precisely what gave rise, say, to Lord Byron or William Blake maybe, gave rise to some of the great creativity. So the mental divergence, if you have a culture of creativity, can actually be channeled to be a source of intrinsic motivation, where in a sense, therefore, mental divergence could be a gift, or a mental illness could be a gift if it was channeled. But if it is not channeled, then it becomes a force of destruction, which is a Hegelian contingency, right? Where it's like contingent progress. If this is channeled, then it will be a good thing. If it is not channeled, it will be a force of destruction. Which, of course, the problem is if you have a culture that emphasizes extrinsic motivation, it likely won't be so channeled, and that could be an issue.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and just even thinking about the idea of being in that place and writing about it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Painting about it. Making, and I don't mean to make it so, the emphasis so on intrinsic motivation being linked to art, an expression, but I do think that, again, we're talking about taking something inside, okay, and making it and bringing it out.
Yes.
Okay, for the sake of it being something you value.
Yes.
But I think we have to value life. We have to value our own lives, in a sense. I guess what I mean to say is a lot of times people feel like they don't feel that value of their own.
No.
And so I guess just thinking about I don't know, and perhaps there could just be a reciprocity in saying to do that, to make something, to create is almost to protest against this devaluation or lack of valuation for one's life.
Yes.
To value making something, the small, the sort of the, you saying it matters to me, or I'm going to just choose to make something, and this little thing, whatever it is, this little poem matters, is almost this giant, I don't know, I almost want to say I think it can be this, there's something there that could be a way to protest against the lack of value or something. It's almost like it's a small notion and a small effort, but it sort of makes a big gesture to say that we can value things. We can value life itself,
Yes.
which is so fragile and complicated, but it's also so beautiful. And the small seed is what can yield, a tree.
Well,
Large things, large, you know what I mean? So, I don't know, I guess I'm just thinking about, art and why it tends to kind of be things that people make, that is tied to intrinsic motivation, and in that place of feeling the despair, I don't know, I guess it's almost but can't the person just be why would it matter? But see, to just say, I don't know if it matters or not, but I'm just going to do it, and kind of even just the act of doing it shows a type of caring that could then reinvigorate a care for their own life itself or something like that.
Well, the world outside the individual is causation. Causation is the realm of determinism. Determinism has no values. There's no moral values, there's no values at all, there's just cause and effect. The world is valueless outside the human. Where there is only causality, there are no values. The only possible sources of creation in the universe that we know about are human beings, or sentient beings, or conscious beings, or the human consciousness. As far as we know, we'll just take that. Therefore, if there are going to be values, or value, in the world, it must come from inside of people out. It must come from creation, as opposed to causation.
Right.
And if there's no values in the world, then what's the point of living, right? If there are values in the world, then there's reasons to be alive.
Right.
Therefore, intrinsic motivation is motivation for values that humans create. So intrinsic motivation, this is very important. So intrinsic motivation, therefore, is its own grounding. It is axiomatic. In the same way that Heidegger and all these different people are looking for a kind of, well, Heidegger was against transcendental ground, but this notion of, can there be a kind of grounding? Can there be a kind of justification for a thing? I don't know if I would use the language of transcendental grounding, because that has a lot of philosophical baggage. But intrinsic motivation creates its own world, in a sense. It creates its own being. It creates its own justification, because it creates the values that then motivate it to create values. And therefore creates a new kind of being. It gives rise to the created being as opposed to the caused being. The unknown is the yet to be known. Mm-hmm. And before you have painted your painting is not known. The world in which your painting exists is not known. Mm-hmm. It is yet to be known. It is an unknown. All creation is a movement of the unknown into the realm of the yet to be known, and then the known. Mm-hmm. And so it's a movement of time gathering, if you will, a kind of gathering, a bringing into gathering that you're engaged with. And so the thing is that creation proves that the unknown is not unknowable, mm-hmm. that it can be known.
Yes.
And thus, there's hope.
Yes.
So creation is what creates the values that justify intrinsic motivation, mm-hmm. and also gives you reason to believe that unknowability may just be unknown, and thus is yet to be known and can be known. And so that creates an entirely different system of being, motivation, and values that creates a new way of life, as opposed to a way of life that is indeed unable to see values and is just living in accordance with cause and effect. And when you live according to mere causation, then you are determined to not have values, because there are no values in determination unless you create amidst that determination and direct it towards something new, something unknown, that in that act of creation you make known.
Absolutely. And I do think, like, it makes me think of my talk with Jockin on art therapy. Because I do think
Absolutely.
There's something particularly unique to art as a means of, a therapeutic avenue back to intrinsic motivation, because
yes.
you are taking something inside of yourself and kind of putting it in front of yourself.
Yes.
You're kind of discovering yourself in creating something, in creating art, in creating your...
It's an expression of
story,
the subject,
poetry,
so that the subject can see itself in a new light and therefore come to a different understanding of itself.
Right, and that's why to me it's different than just going, like, not this
Sure,
is just,
sure.
but like going for a run. There's a great
Sure.
place for going for a run, and
Of
for
course.
some people that does the trick, or like that's
Sure.
something really helpful for them. But I do think there's something about the creative act that ties in with everything you just said so beautifully, and that is so, so important to acknowledge and recognize as a very great resource for us.
Well, running may help you feel your body in the world into
Yes.
which we have been thrown, and to come to terms with your body, and to accept and integrate with your body as a being. Whereas art can be the facing of the subject, of the subject's own possibilities, and to see them in a new light, and to see that, in fact, the subject can create, and therefore, what must the nature of the subject be to be able to create, and why did the subject create this? And what does that mean about this particular subject? And so art has a particularly unique way of mapping the subject to itself so that it can see itself, which can then maybe heal it from doubts of thinking that it's powerless, because look, you did create this, and what does that mean about you to create this, and what might you create alternatively and more so if you were to engage in further healing and to be motivated by your own capacity to create what you have now witnessed and know you can do. What would that drive you into? And if you take that seriously, maybe you would create a different world than the one you have been in that has led you to art therapy.
Right.
So it can motivate you in that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
But philosophy can really, I think, go a long way to help us regain wonder. It's had a long history, unfortunately, of making us think in terms of unknowability, which, again, there's some value to know your limits so that you can, say, sublate them in a Hegel. But there's also the history of understanding philosophy in terms of wonder, which is to say that there are things unknown that we can come to know, and that once we know those, there will be more to know and more to know and more to know, and that can give you a life of endless motivation, because there's always something to do. There's always something to head toward, and that will transform how you engage with other people and how you engage with yourself. So to have that hermeneutics of wonder and there being the unknown, which is exciting but also scary, but also something to rise to the occasion of being ready for, but also to respect and to honor, there's just a much more complicated dynamic by which you come to engage with life, as opposed to, does this stimulate me, or do I like what I'm consuming? The entire horizon of life becomes something very different when you have that, the ability to think in terms of wonder, which then creates the motivation to create, which then creates values that motivates further intrinsic motivation, and then further intrinsic motivation on and on, where we're not just thrown in the middle of some ocean of cause and effect that we cannot control, some sort of determination that alienates us, but instead we can, in a way, create back. We can transform the direction of that causation into the direction in which we create, which just transforms the entire world into a place that alienates us and that pushes us down and that depresses us into a place that can be full of wonder and wonderful.
That was great, Daniel. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you. For more by OG Rose, please visit the website, YouTube, Instagram,
Snapchat,
TikTok, yeah, all these different things. I don't even know if Snapchat is, I guess their stock price got obliterated because of their ad revenue forecast. But Anchor, Instagram, Facebook, and
yes. Thank you so much for
thank
your time.
you for your time.